Counter storytelling and learning from the stories of the African diaspora. So for this particular presentation, we're going to have Christopher CGreen, Estelle Bougna Fomeju, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah, who are going to present. And Estelle, if you don't mind, I will read Christopher's bio. Christopher Clyde Green is a teacher. Oh, hold on, stop sharing my screen. Christopher Clyde Green is a teacher of literature and TOK IB Workshop Leader School Accreditation team member and a writer. He is a self-confessed lifelong learner and a UK-born Swiss living citizen of the world. He has worked globally and practiced a variety of educational programs. Christopher has written for various media outlets and publishers, including HarperCollins and the Times Educational Supplement on world literature and education. Christopher has been a graduate and undergraduate student of the London, Cambridge, and Harvard universities. He will share some of his insight on why developing different perspectives in literature lessons curriculum matters, so that all of our students can be seen and heard. He will also discuss why expanding our knowledge of non-Western cultures is essential in our attempts to fully understand the human condition. Christopher, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. And Kevin, I'm going to ask you to help me with sharing our slides as well. Thank you. Estelle, would you mind reading our next presenter?
Of course, of course. I introduce you to my twin, Estelle Bougna Fomeju, only much younger than me. I have to acknowledge that. Estelle is really a Pan-African consultant in education. She's passionate about history as well, cultural inclusion, anti-racism, and indigenous worldviews. Estelle founded TISI, which is a consultancy in education for social change based in Mali, and we collaborate together, TC and Africa Learning International, for the course TWICE, teaching with inclusion and culture embedded. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to this amazing woman with a lot of talent and a lot of things to share on our theme today. And the third person who will be talking today is our very own Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. Do we still introduce him? I don't know. Well,
I think Estelle, you go.
Yeah, I go. I'll do that with great pleasure. Well, Kwame exemplifies really what it means to be a revolutionary leader in the education field. I think throughout his 15 years career as a public school educator, author, and entrepreneur, Kwame has been on a personal mission to uplift and empower educators who are committed to reversing the ills of a public education system in America and globally too. He's the founder of Identity Talk Consulting LLC, and we work together on the African Affinity Group of ALOC with Rama and KMensah. So yes, Kwame, it's a pleasure to introduce you today and to attract the attention of our friends here to the fantastic work that we've been doing with your podcast and also with the books that you have written. Maybe you can share more about that with us. So let's start straight away with either of you.
All right. Thank you, Estelle and Rama. Hello again, everybody. So the name of our presentation is going to be focused on counter storytelling and the importance of it in African diaspora. And it's three of us, so I'm going to do my absolute best to kind of speed through these slides so that Chris and Estelle can share their information, which I believe is so important. So, all right, let's get started. So the first question that we have is, how do we go about developing pedagogy and the curriculum to reflect the students in front of us? So there are a few steps that we have to take. Number one, and I think we can all agree on this, we have to do some self-work, some self-reflection, and interrogate our biases. So what you see before you is a racial literacy development model that was created by Dr. Yolanda Celia Ruiz. And she is a professor at Columbia University in the English department, and she does a lot of work around racial literacy. And her whole theory is around this idea of archaeology of the self. So when we think about archaeologists are always digging beneath the surface to find some object, to find something valuable. So now in this aspect, we're digging deep down our own teacher journeys and lives to figure out why we have these biases. And as we go through this process, as we go through this deep excavation, we are starting to have these different feelings that are coming about. There's critical love, there's critical humility. When we are able to gain knowledge of self about who we are and our biases, we're able to be more humble, or open, and learning more about those facts that we have to unlearn. So humility has to be a part of it. And love, being able to have empathy towards others as you're trying to gain your understanding of their perspectives as it pertains to race, class, culture, and other identifiers. And as you go up this hierarchical pyramid, you'll realize that reflection has to take place, which I just talked about. There's historical literacy. And then ultimately, you reach a point where you're able to interrupt racism and inequality within your school communities. But in order for you to even get to that interruption point, you have to go through that self-evaluative process to understand your biases. So definitely check out Yolanda Celia Ruiz, Archaeology of the Self. It's a very great model. All right, next slide, please. Number 2, of course, we have to evaluate our systems, and that requires us to do equity audits. So when we think about equity audits, we have to assess our systems, our protocols, our policies that we have in place within our schools. So since we're talking about curriculum and pedagogy specifically, we have to look at what books are in our libraries, right? We also have to assess our instructional approaches. Are we instructing our students in a way that is inclusive and meeting the diverse needs of all of our learners, regardless of what their identities are, right? So really looking at the curriculum as a whole, are there instances where there's instructional bias? Are certain narratives invisible in different textbooks? Are we omitting some facts that students need to know about who they are so that they can develop a more positive sense of self? So really just taking the time to assess those systems and different curricular materials within your classroom and to a greater degree, your school community. So that's important, equity audits. Next slide, please. And then, of course, as you're trying to develop your pedagogy and also build your curriculum, you have to engage in proactive and continuous capacity building. So often we talk about people who say that they're doing the work, but it comes off as being performative and not genuine. So when I say proactive, that means that we can't wait for people to tell us to do the work. We have to take the initiative to learn about the things that we don't know as it pertains to anti-bias and anti-racist education. So if you look here, there are a few books that I've recommended on the left. Textured Teaching by Lorena Herman, Cultivating Genius by Dr. Golden Muhammad, and then Start Here, Start Now by Liz Kleinrock. Those are 3 awesome books that you can add to your library in order to learn more about anti-bias and anti-racist education. Of course, as you're building your capacity, you have to do it in community with people who are like-minded. So right now, were at the Ali and ALOC conference talking about decolonizing the African curriculum. So we're together learning about our experiences and building knowledge collectively. We need to be in these communities in order to continue to refresh our pedagogical approaches, but also to keep ourselves accountable when it comes time for us to take our practices into the classroom. And of course, there are a lot of other organizations that we've been mentioning throughout this conference who are doing great work. So definitely check those out. And then of course, we cannot, I'm sorry, go back to that last slide, please. And of course, we cannot do this work if we're not co-creating these learning experiences with students. So if anybody's read Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he talks about this idea of banking where the teacher is up in the front and they're depositing knowledge to students and students are just taking the knowledge in, but there's no exchange between teacher and student. So if we're trying to create this optimal learning environment, we have to continue to check in with our learners, find out how they best learn, how they best process information, how they want to acquire knowledge. If we're not doing that as teachers, there's no way that we can continue to develop and refresh our pedagogical approaches. All right, thank you. Next slide. Second question we have is, how do we help students, our students, develop a positive sense of self in the curriculum? So one way to do it is by showing them movies and documentaries that provide positive narratives about African culture, but also other cultures as well. But since we're focused on Africa, I have some African movie examples in front of us. So one example particular that I recently came across is this first movie by Ousmane Sébène, who is an African cinematologist. He's from Senegal. A lot of people consider Mr. Sébène as the father of African cinema. Imagine if you have students in the classroom who have aspirations of being film directors. If they knew about someone like Mr. Ousmane Sébène, maybe they'll be more inspired to want to continue to pursue that path. So when we think about counter storytelling, it's about providing narratives that will allow students to aspire to something greater than what they can only imagine. So of course we have Black Panther, which we all know about, Seraphine as a classic, and they have Queen of Katwe, which is another great movie, all of which are speaking about positive narratives about the African continent. Next slide, please. And then also, we need to tap into our local and virtual communities. So the internet is such a fascinating tool. And I'm aware that not everybody may have access to the internet where they are, but if you do, something as simple as a tweet, a cold tweet, just to find out if people are interested in coming to the classroom to speak, is huge. So recently, I went on Twitter and I asked if there were certain Black professionals in the STEM field who would be interested in being guest speakers for my high school geometry class, which I teach virtually from Freetown, where I am. And if you look at the numbers right below, you have over 130 retweets, 230 likes, and a whole list of recommendations just came popping up. And I was able to do a 2-month Black in STEM speaker series, all because of one tweet. I reached out to the virtual community and they delivered big time. Now, let's say you don't have the internet. There are people within your local communities where your schools are surrounded who you can reach out to. Look at your local leaders. they can bring something to the table. And if we're talking about international schools, one thing that I've always mentioned is the fact that a lot of international schools generally operate in a bubble where they don't allow for a lot of people from the local communities to come and contribute in a positive way. So if you were to open up your space to bring people from the community, you'll be able to get a more authentic sense of what the community is about. And then students are able to see themselves in a positive light. And if you look here on the right, I actually read a book to my son's class. My son is in pre-K, and I went into his class a couple weeks ago to do a lesson about the history of Ghana for International Day, and it was just an awesome experience. So just want to share that. Next slide, please. And then the last thing I'll say is books are huge. And I don't want to touch too much on this because I know Chris is going to speak more about the importance of books and literature and counter storytelling, but just know that there are many children's books out there that provide stories of some of our greatest African heroes. So whether it's Pan-African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, whether it's environmentalists like Wangari Maathai from Kenya, whether it's other historical figures, the books are out there. So make sure you go out, do your research, and see how you can diversify your libraries by adding books like these in front. Next slide.
All right, so this is Estelle, Bougna, Fomeju. Now that we've covered a lot on these big questions, how do you develop a positive sense of self? How you help students develop that, and what are the pedagogical tools that can help you do that? Some of them, because we'll cover a little bit more. It's important to now focus on this idea of counter narratives and trying to understand how they're even essential to the teaching of Africa in the curriculum. So when we speak of counter narrative, we are referring to the narrative that arise from the vantage point of those who have been historically marginalized. And the idea of counter itself implies a space of resistance against traditional domination. So that's a definition from the Center for Intercultural Dialogue. And what's interesting to add to this is that the idea of counter narrative also implies that there are narratives out there that do not tell the full story. And those are typically known as dominant narratives. And you may be familiar with the concept, but it's important to really reiterate some of the key elements that make a dominant narrative so that to further emphasize the importance of counter narratives in education. So next, just so Rama, you have to click once because different things will, yeah. So according to the University of Michigan, who has developed a very interesting website with a lot of resources. So you can look up the University of Michigan Inclusive Campus Collaborative. They have a very simple definition for dominant narrative that is very effective. The first thing about dominant narrative is that it's an explanation or a story that is told in service of the dominant social group's interests and ideologies. So it serves the people who hold the power, the people who have control. And dominant narrative, next, usually achieve dominance through repetition and the apparent authority of the speaker. Next, please. The idea is that, most people have heard it, so it must be true. And they're told from the authority of the speaker is apparent just because, well, it's been granted by the stamp of approval of those who have the power. Another thing about dominant narrative is that they ignore and they silence alternative accounts. They ignore other perspectives. And because dominant narratives are so normalized through their repetition and authority, they have the illusion of being objective and apolitical when in fact they are neither. Next, please, Rama. So they're taught as the truth. And so based on this definition and on these elements, actually you can use the chat to share some of those dominant narratives about Africa that you hear a lot, some that have swayed your way of looking at African or Africa or African cultures, some that have traumatized you when growing up. All of that you can share in the chat. It's a safe space. And I'm sure that your responses will show that dominant narratives support oppression and support different forms of violence, and especially they serve racism, one of the forms of violence. And therefore, dominant narratives are inherently threatening to all of our students' well-being and intellectual integrity. And they honestly do not have a place in our curriculum unless it is to debunk them. As we heard this morning, for those who are here with Dr. Sosten, it's as if you teach a dominant narrative, you can, but the thing is you need to posit it in a way that that labels it as a dominant narrative, and you need to propose alternative accounts to really help students acquire the full story, really knowing the full story. So next slide, please. Oh yeah, it's something that we cover in the twice business, right? So dominant narratives, they are a threat to students' well-being, to students' intellectual integrity, and the dominant narratives about Africa that are prevalent in the curriculum, they generate a lot of curriculum violence. And curriculum violence is a term that was coined by two Black scholars, two scholars of African descent, Edgar Doro and Wiggin, and it refers to the deliberate manipulation of academic programming in a manner that ignores or compromises the intellectual and psychological well-being of learners. So because we're here talking about counter narratives and storytelling, I thought it would be very interesting to look at some of the words that an African student who was raised in Britain, went to school in Britain, has to share about her experience about learning about Africa in the curriculum. And these are the words from Daniela Adeluoye, who's a Cambridge University graduate and who wrote this article in Varsity, which is the independent publication of Cambridge University. And so the first thing she shares is that a feeling of shame and humiliation well up inside of her whenever African history was taught or discussed. So that's the first thing. We're talking about teenagers here. Everyone who's familiar with educational psychology or just has experience, anyone who's an educator knows that shame and humiliation and teenagers are not a great combo. They don't do a lot of good. And we've all been through that. So first thing, next, please, Rama. She then says, it obsessed me that British society taught my younger self to be ashamed of Africa's current position, when I now know that it is not Africa's shame that I carry, but rather it is white Britain's unprocessed colonial guilt forced onto me, a person of African heritage, to carry. I mean, these are very, very strong and powerful words. And this is someone sharing the experience not like a year after, probably 2-3 years after the end of school. And so you can see how this is hurtful to the students of African descent. And I'm sure that it is also hurtful to a student of white Britain who would have maybe been more sensitive, or to any students who's committing or perpetrating an act of violence against another student. If they knew more of the full story, they would probably, think twice or probably not even want to engage in all of this. But what's interesting is that in her article, she shows the violence caused by dominant narratives, and she also shows the uplifting power of counter narratives. And you can even skip to the next one, because she's talking to her younger self. And what she's saying, and I will quote the full sentence, is, understand the frustration you feel. I am sorry that you had to feel that way. It is not something that you need to carry. Growing up as a young girl of Nigerian heritage, you're not given any reason by the education system of the country you live in to be proud of your heritage. And she then ends to say, well, to my younger self, don't worry, you will soon love your heritage. and you'll soon learn to accept the fact that your hair won't flow. So go ahead and unfollow the Instagram models that fit your centric standards of beauty, and look for others that look more like you. And you will soon grow to love your heritage. You will soon discover the beauty of Africa's writer, its historical and political figures. You'll get to tell Africa's true narrative. You'll get to tell your own narrative. And so this is super powerful, but it would be great that on top of learning from Instagram and other sources, that whatever knowledge is helpful to building a positive sense of self is coming from an institution that has that level of authority. The rigor of the information would be much more supportive of that transformation for the students. So it's very important to make sure that on top of all the alternative resources that students may have access to now because of the age we live in, it's important that schools contribute because they are ultimately, the most regarded as the most powerful or authoritative source of knowledge. So next slide. And so ultimately, counter narratives, we spoke a little bit about the definition earlier. So here are just some of the things that I want to highlight to sort of conclude before, letting Christopher really share a lot of really good resources and just much more on this. Really, counter narratives reestablish quintessential facts that allow us to better understand the state of the world. And better understanding the state of the world will help students really build a positive sense of self and just be able to navigate the world a little bit with more ease. So counter narrative helps shape a different discourse because they're told by the traditionally observed, and Chris will expand on this. So I will switch to the next one and you'll see. Counter narratives also elevates indigenous paradigms. So not just indigenous voices, but indigenous construction of the world. And so it's important to strengthen this because counter narratives may not always fit. The validity of counter narratives may not always be measured by the way dominant narratives are deemed or stamped valid. So the format of the resources, we spoke to, earlier this morning, Sylvia, Madame Sylvia was here, and she was discussing how she gets access to the sources to write her books and so on. And the methods will be different. Another important thing about counter narratives is that, they're discredited by the dominant group. So a lot of counter narratives may be stamped as like conspiracy theorists, weird propaganda things. So, stay lucid. Now, next thing, counter narrative, they expose the violence of the dominant group, because a lot of counter narratives would tell that other aspect of the story. Think of Christopher Columbus. That's a dominant narrative. Think about a counter narrative of that story. There you have it. It's also important to say, though, although I've said that indigenous paradigms may not look like the dominant paradigms, it's important to say that counter narratives, what they do is that they elevate also the work of scholars that is very rigorous. Scholars that are, well-known, coming from all origins, all fields, biology, history, paleontology, anthropology, you name it, for decades, for centuries, sources that are there, that are rigorous, and that also back those counter narratives. And ultimately, last thing I want to say about this, that it serves humanity. While dominant narrative serves the people in power, counter narrative serves humanity because, knowing the full story allows us to really learn from our mistakes. We can't just obstruct a whole entire perspective and a whole entire understanding of a fact and then hope that we'll still manage to heal and truly get on this road towards a transformation of our society towards something more equitable and just. So there you have it. There's another slide, but I'll let Chris talk and then we'll see if we have time for that. So you can just skip to Christopher. It's another pedagogical tool taken from Twice, but yeah.
Thank you very much. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. It's a pleasure to be here. I just wanted to start off, first of all, to talk about the main question for my part, which is how can we learn from the stories of African diaspora and what role do they play in counter storytelling? So first things first, I think African cultural experiences are rarely taught within the classrooms of international schools. I've taught at 4, and there only seems to be a meager amount of authors mentioned when it comes to teaching about African realities and African cultural experiences. So I'm here to maybe try and give us some ideas of where we can do that and which text we can provide. But this group is even smaller when it comes to stories from people of the African diaspora. And this session, I hope, will explore how we can develop our knowledge of fiction and non-fiction writers of African descent and help us and our learners understand life from a atypical perspective, basically, in international education. So perhaps, why isn't there enough literature from the African diaspora and African experience? Perhaps this is due to teachers feeling a lack of confidence or support to teach beyond their own cultures, or a lack of African authors in the constructed syllabi, whether it be from the IB or below the IB or otherwise. With frameworks in place, the IB has tried to help this, I think, but these reasons that I don't have the confidence to teach from another culture, from a different culture to my own, or from a diverse culture, seems weaker and weaker. Maybe there should be more people of color involved in the construction of syllabi. Maybe teachers need to display more humility. Perhaps classrooms should be circular and not square, and perhaps the relationship between the student and the teacher might be revolutionized. I wish to mention those texts from of African descent, and also from the African diaspora, as well as those who are indigenous, as I often feel is overlooked.
I'm sorry, you're muted. There you go.
Oh, okay, sorry. I'll have to start again then. I just said I want to mention those who are people of African descent from the diaspora as well, because I think sometimes they're overlooked. For example, I'm of African Caribbean descent, and people often look at us as a tree without roots. So in the African indigenous people and people of African descent are often the observed, as was mentioned previously, in the literature classroom. And these texts that I'm going to present hopefully help us to look at how we can pivot that role and challenge that role, and they can be the observer rather than the observed. And why is this important? It shows that anthropological studies are not one-sided, and it presents a different vantage point for students of color and students of European descent and otherwise. And it makes studies more inclusive of students of color, rather than exoticizing them through a consistent Eurocentric gaze that often presents stereotypical depictions of Africans and those of African descent. I did my dissertation on Joseph Conrad when I was a student, and it looked at his idea of presenting the other. As he sailed around the world, the other sort of had the same depiction. Exterminate the brutes is one of the last things that Kurt says in Heart of Darkness. We're still looked at at these brutes. So here are some of the texts in front of, yes, and on the slide, thanks very much. So I also want to look at the intersectionality within the African narrative, and I wanted to look at it within nonfiction. So if we could just go back to the next slide. Sorry about that. Thanks very much. So I wanted to look at Afropean, and Afropean is a piece of travel writing by Johnny Pitts. It's Black travel writing, basically, about a guy talking about African and Black cultural environments within Europe. He talks about the observer being the observed being the observer, exploring how different European and African communities developed despite their marginalization. So he's writing in a way sometimes for the voiceless. And I'd also like to pick up on the idea of intersectionality. I know that someone in the chat talked about how Africa was presented as a poor place, and African people was presented in this sort of poverty porn scenario. One of them is a piece of nonfiction by a person from a wealthy background. He is a Etonian, and he talks about his experience of being in one of the most prestigious schools in the world as an African student. This erases this idea of white savior sentiment. And there's also another book I want to add, but it's not here. Colson Whitehead, he's a great African-American author. He wrote a novel called Sag Harbor. And Sag Harbor is just basically about his experience as a kid, going off to, as an African-American kid, hanging out with his family and hanging out in one of the most affluent areas in America, in Sag Harbor. So there you are. It's not always presented in that way in the books that we receive in the classroom. Then I want to talk about another intersectionality, which is looking at LGBTQ plus concerns. So The Stranger in the Village is about how we had James Baldwin, who was an African-American homosexual male, traveling to Switzerland with his partner. And he talked about how he was being looked at and treated in Switzerland in terms of how he was treated in America, in this apparently land of the free, and apparently this place of unity, et cetera, and the parallels there. So it's a really interesting idea to look into that. And I wanted to look into it in intersectionality as well. So it's not just like, okay, this is Africa, but what about the different stratas found within Africa? One of the things that I find quite interesting as well is that the writer's predicament, an African writer's predicament sometimes is that they're trying to explain colonialism and racist ideas and the suppression of African languages within the language of the oppressor. And also the writer ends up becoming part of the petit bourgeois. So, you know, to be a writer, you have to be educated. To be a writer in English, you have to have an experience within a schooling system that almost already is colonizing your mind. And it's really interesting. I could talk for ages about this, but I know I need to hurry up. So the next slide, please. Okay, so these are some non-fiction sections. I think you already looked at maybe Bernardine Evaristo. She's a very celebrated author from Britain, and she talks about Mr. Loverman, and that's one text. There's an interesting text here by Nadifa Mohammed, and it's about a guy in Wales, in Cardiff's Tiger Bay, which bustles with Somali and West Indian sailors and Maltese businessmen in 1952. Some of the students in the classroom probably didn't even think, I don't know, Afro-Caribbean people existed before 1952 in Britain. He's a smooth talker, he has a charm about him, but a shopkeeper is brutally murdered, and all eyes suddenly fall on Mahmoud himself. And it talks about how he has a relationship with a Welsh woman, how they have children. And it's just a really interesting idea, seeing a different story from in a very British scenario, but from an African perspective. We also have The Lonely Londoners, which is an Indian Trinidadian writing about Afro-Caribbean people in London. So there's a gaze upon a gaze upon a gaze, and it's really interesting seeing how he's observing their stories. And also that book is comical, it's funny, it's amusing, it's engaging. So it's not always about the drama of African-American experience or the drama of Afro-European experience. It's also like, what were the funny things that happen in their experience too? And then lastly, I wanted to look at A Small Place. And A Small Place focuses on the idea of, it's basically a savage rebuttal to colonial tourism within the Caribbean. And she basically presents a piece of creative nonfiction, which is a reply, so it's addressed in the second person, which is addressed to the British or the Westerner visiting her island and actually suffocating her island's people from being anything beyond tourists, I wouldn't say slaves, but tourist servants in a sense, and diminishing the economy of her area. So that's A Small Place by Jamaica Kincaid. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. One thing that people say is, oh, it's very hard to make connections between the text and how do I talk about it from my own cultural experiences? It's not about necessarily the teacher, it's also about the student. And I think it's a good idea to think about how we can make connections with the text. So theoretical processes help to empower the student to voice their own ideas and realize that all art that they're studying is interrelated in a sense. Teachers will feel more able to explore unknown texts and push innovation and honesty and experimentation, I think, just through this simple formatting. So if we can just try and flip the slide, please. So text to history, it connects the novel to something from the past, and it can be anything in terms of the person who's reading the text past or the past of the author, so the context of composition. and the context of reception, what was happening at the time that the author wrote it, and how was it received. Text to self talks about connecting the book to the reader's experiences. Have I ever felt pain? Have I ever experienced what war might be like? Have I ever felt an emotion? Well, yes, you have. So most of this stuff is about feeling empathetic experiences and ensuring that your mind reaches the highest level of intelligence, which I think is imagination. And then text to the world is connecting the text to something the reader knows about, but but hasn't directly experienced it, such as a current event like the Ukrainian war, or something like the situation in apartheid in South Africa. So connecting it to the world events that are happening or previously happened. Text to text, connecting the novel to another text that might be similar to it. If there's connecting themes, they can show that there's an interrelatedness connected to both texts, and that might encourage them to read more. It could even be a movie they've seen, as mentioned in the previous discussion with Black Panther and other texts. It could be a poem or a song or a work of art, but it doesn't necessarily have to be something from Africa in itself. But the text that they're studying in school could be from Africa, and this could show them how they can connect to it, even though it might be text that they at first seemed alien to them. Okay, that's me. I thank you very much, and I think now it's time for discussion, so I hope there's enough time.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Kwame. Thank you, Estelle. Masterful tips and profound food for thought for teachers. Thank you. I bet everybody is looking forward to getting the YouTube recording of these sessions. I'm learning so much. Yes, I think that, yeah, there's a lot happening in the chat. And just have a look when you finish presenting to see what kind of discussion you have generated. Books exchanged, and not many questions, because it was more about you inspiring a lot of thinking in the room. And for that, I really have to thank you. It's true that unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for the question sessions, because we will be starting our next session in literally 2 to 3 minutes. So I invite you to just enjoy the chat, and if there's some burning questions, you can unmute and ask it. A lot of thank yous. Time now to highlight the Farrier Education Group and the Mini PD, who are massive supporters of this conference. We thank you for that. Thanks to contributions like this, we were talking about it this morning, how this work needs resources, needs people, needs time, needs money. Yes, so thanks to Mini PD, we got a little bit of these resources that we need to make these conferences, this conference in particular, happen. And it's also time for me to sincerely highlight the speakers who have volunteered the time and energy, and without a proper remuneration, to do this fantastic work that is shared with you today. So yes, we need to acknowledge that. We are only starting. Hopefully with time, we'll be able to remunerate everybody like profusely and well. Yeah, we need to talk about these issues too, you know, and this will be thanks to your support. So I'm thanking also the participants who have decided this year to support us by sponsoring the conference. We're going to take literally 2 minutes break before our next session, led by Raman Diai and Tamkara Adu.